Okay, well, previously I left off describing an idea originated by one of my favorite philosophers, the idea of the body of water, essentially as one of the many manifestations of the world in which we live, the fluctuation of which is caused by its complex interrelationship with other atmospheric elements, including the wind, the size of the waves, the strength of the waves, all of which are in some way determined by particular atmospheric components. Now, if we sort of extend this analogy into the realm of consciousness, we have a very interesting situation, because we can suggest that the process of peopling that our world employs, in other words, the fluctuation of human life, the beginning and the end of individual human lives, just essentially the entire cycle of life, could be said to be a very example of a fluctuation of this consciousness grid in response to particular atmospheric elements. Now, what would these particular atmospheric elements be? Well, in the case of the water, obviously, it would basically be very concrete sort of components, the wind, whatnot. Also, of course, you have to take into consideration the makeup of the water. I'm not sure, I'm no geologist or anything. I can't tell you exactly what determines the particular state of a body of water. But I think that in the case of the consciousness grid, we could argue that the atmospheric elements are essentially any components of our universe that are in some way either conducive to or hostile to the emergence and maintenance of life. Because these two components, butting heads with one another, I think you could say would create a degree of turbulence, allowing for fluctuations of this consciousness grid, maintaining this act of peopling that our world has obviously employed. Now, what does this actually mean in terms of an afterlife? This is the idea that I find to be the most interesting personally. Is it in some ways similar to reincarnation? Because are we essentially saying that once my form dies and a particular smoothing out, I guess you could say, of the consciousness grid occurs, and another pinpoint or another wave takes my place, could it be said that I've been reincarnated? Has my conscious experience picked up in the form of another human being where this previous one is left off? Well, what I think essentially separates this idea from the traditional idea of reincarnation is the notion that, as I said before, there is no individual soul to leave the body. Now, once again, coming back to the profundity, I guess you could say, of the idea of there being a consciousness grid, I think that this profundity takes root in the notion that in order to really establish this idea, you have to note the complete lack of any kind of lines of demarcation separating one conscious entity from another. Now, obviously, there are physical boundaries, individual human bodies that are born and that die, and that are very autonomous, very separate from one another. But you could also argue that this individuality only exists in a very superficial sense, in the same way that there are individual waves in an ocean. Obviously, you can distinguish one wave from another because they're individuals, but moving beyond the whole concept of a wave, what do we see? We essentially see that there are no real waves. There's simply water waving. This basically tells us then that the idea of reincarnation could not really be said to apply, because as I am conscious now, my experience of consciousness is only separate from anybody else's experience of consciousness in very superficial ways. These ways being imposed on me by the limitations of my physical body. But in the same way that you could say that a brick is part of a house, or that, a book is part of a library, you could essentially say that a human being is basically part of this entity, this manifesting entity that appears to utilize this very ingenious process of natural selection in order to create a very beautiful series of manifested entities sort of interacting with one another. Now I know that I'm getting a little bit cryptic here, maybe moving off the mark a little bit, but I would like to stress the importance of the idea of the consciousness wave theory as being one in which you can make no real distinction between one individual and another individual beyond the obvious distinctions made as a result of the boundaries imposed on us by our physical bodies. There is no separation beyond the superficial. Now, all of this, I think, leads to kind of interesting possibilities when we consider the notion of artificial intelligence, it itself obviously being a very controversial idea. Perhaps later on I'll make another video addressing this notion. It could essentially be said from certain standpoints that my ideas might be threatened by the notion of artificial intelligence being a true possibility. But then again, I think that I would basically argue that if we were basically able to replicate a human brain, given I don't think that personally, I'm not sure that we will ever be able to do so because it's just such a highly complex organ, but let's say that we could completely replicate the experience of consciousness so that a machine would basically, other than on an external level, be indistinguishable from a human being. Well, my line of thinking, that wouldn't be an abomination of the process. It would simply be an extension of the process. It would be a radical new atmospheric element, in the same way that you could argue that a dog breeder is an extension of the process of natural selection. At any rate, I would like to stop here. I hope that you have found this video interesting, and I'm curious to hear what other people might want to say on the issue. But till next time, everybody take care.